The blizzard didn't kill him. His own blood did. Times Square, the city that never sleeps, had gone completely silent. No horns, no music, no voices, just white, just wind. Just the kind of cold that reaches inside a man's chest and squeezes whatever warmth is left. Snow blanketed the streets in thick, unbroken sheets. Neon signs flickered behind walls of ice. Cabs had stopped running an hour ago. The few souls still outside moved fast, heads down, scarves pulled over their mouths, moving like they were afraid the blizzard would notice them if they slowed down. But one man wasn't moving at all. He sat in the center of the storm alone, soaked, abandoned in a high-tech wheelchair that had been engineered to the specification of a man who accepted nothing ordinary. His black hair was plastered to his face. His white dress shirt, tailored and expensive, clung to his chest like a second skin. His hands that had once made entire crime families fall to their knees, rested completely still in his lap. His eyes were open, but he couldn't speak, couldn't call out, couldn't even turn his head. He could only feel. The ice collecting on his eyelashes, the slow, creeping numbness, traveling up from his fingertips toward his heart. The humiliation of being fully conscious inside a body that had been turned off like a switch. People walked past him. A man in a fur coat glanced over and kept moving. A woman with a stroller crossed to the other side of the street. A delivery boy slowed his bike, looked once, and pedaled harder. Nobody stopped. Because to everyone in that blizzard, J.S. Park looked like a problem that wasn't theirs to solve. He looked broken. He looked finished. He looked like someone the city had already decided to forget. And maybe that was exactly what his brother had counted on. Then through the white, a flicker of gold appeared. Small, warm, stubborn against the dark. She moved like she owned the storm. 7 years old, with 2 braided puffs dusted in snowflakes and a red coat 2 sizes too big that dragged slightly through the slush. She carried a lantern, an old thing, glowing amber held out in front of her like a torch against every monster the night could throw. Her dark eyes were wide and sharp, scanning every corner, every shadow, every face. She had run away from her group home 3 hours ago. She had exactly 1 piece of stolen bread, 1 lantern, and 0 fear of the cold because Nala had already learned early in her 7 years of life that the cold inside people was far worse than anything the weather could do. She almost walked right past him. But she stopped. She tilted her head, studied him the way children study things that don't make sense without judgment, without pretense, just a quiet, searching honesty that most adults lose somewhere around age 10. She stepped closer, brushed the snow off his shoulder with 1 small, deliberate hand, and then she sat down beside his wheelchair on the frozen ground, opened her coat, and pressed the warm side of it against his arm. "I know you can hear me," she whispered, her voice low and steady like she'd said it before to people who couldn't answer. "The monsters can't find us in the dark. My lantern keeps them away." I checked. Beneath the fabric, barely visible, barely real, J.S. Park's finger twitched. High above them, in the glass eye of a skyscraper 30 floors up, a man in black pressed his eye against a thermal scope and exhaled 1 slow, controlled breath. He had been watching for 2 hours. His boss was still alive. And somewhere across the city, in a penthouse wrapped in warmth and silence, the man who had ordered all of this, the man who had stripped the jade ring from J.S. Park's frozen finger and walked away laughing, poured himself a glass of whiskey and waited for confirmation that the blizzard had done its job. He was still waiting, because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the most dangerous man in New York had just been found by the one person in the city he could never have planned for, a little girl with a lantern. And she wasn't leaving. J.S. Park hadn't always been a ghost. There was a time before the syndicate, before the empire, before the name that made grown men go quiet in crowded rooms, when he was just a boy who understood one thing too early, that the world only protects what it values, and the moment something loses its power, the world lets it freeze. But Nala had been learning that same lesson her whole life. And somehow in the middle of the worst blizzard New York had seen in 40 years, those 2 invisible people had found each other. This is where the story really begins. The cold had a sound. It wasn't the wind, though the wind was savage, a living, breathing thing that tore through Times Square like it had a grudge. It wasn't the snow either, though the snow fell so thick and so fast it swallowed the streetlights whole and turned the world into a wall of white silence. No, the cold had a deeper sound than all of that. It was the sound of absolute stillness inside a man who was screaming. J.S. Park counted heartbeats. That was all he could do. His mind razor-sharp, tactically precise, the same mind that had orchestrated the quiet dismantling of 4 rival syndicates without a single public trace, was fully operational. But his body had been stolen from him. Every nerve below his neck had been silenced by something clinical, something deliberate, something that told him this betrayal had been planned long before tonight. Nobody used a jellyfish neurotoxin on impulse. That kind of poison required sourcing, patience, intimacy with a target's schedule, access to his food, his drink, his world. This had been someone close, someone who ate at his table. He counted 142 heartbeats since they left him here. 142 beats since his own brother had crouched in front of the wheelchair eye level, almost tender, and slid the jade ring from his frozen finger like a man collecting an inheritance he'd already spent. "You were always too soft for this throne," his brother had said quietly. No rage, no drama, just the flat certainty of a man who had decided something a long time ago. The cold will make it clean. Then he stood, straightened his coat, and walked away into the white. The toxin was temporary, Park knew that. He had catalogued it the moment it hit his bloodstream, cross-referenced it against everything he knew about chemical compounds used in high-end assassinations. Box jellyfish derived, synthesized for duration control, 6 hours, give or take 20 minutes depending on body mass and core temperature. The problem was core temperature. The cold was accelerating the shutdown. Every degree his body lost extended the paralysis, and if his temperature dropped past a certain threshold, the toxin wouldn't need to finish him, the blizzard would. He had perhaps 4 hours left. Then the lantern appeared. He smelled her before he saw her, something warm and strange cutting through the metallic bite of snow. Shea butter, cheap soap, the particular sweetness of a child who had been running. She moved into his line of vision like something out of a fever dream. Small, fiercely upright, her dark brown skin dusted with snowflakes that caught the lantern's amber glow and turned her into something almost sacred. Her braids were coming loose at the ends, 2 puffs at the top of her head slowly surrendering to the wind. And her red coat, enormous on her small frame, was darkening at the hem where it dragged through the slush. She wasn't frightened of him. That was the first thing that registered in his tactical mind as extraordinary. Grown men hesitated at the edge of rooms when he entered. Hardened criminals found reasons to look at their phones when he passed. But this child, this small, serious, absolutely unintimidated child, crouched in front of his wheelchair and looked directly into his eyes with the kind of unflinching assessment that most of his lieutenants couldn't manage. "You're not dead," she said. It wasn't a question. She reached out with one small hand and brushed the accumulated snow from his shoulder. Deliberate, careful, the way someone touches something they've decided matters. "I know, because dead people don't look scared. And you look scared." She sat beside him on the frozen ground, pulled back one side of her enormous coat and pressed the warm lining against his arm. Then she opened the small canvas bag she carried and produced a piece of bread, dense, dark, the kind distributed at institutional group homes, and broke it carefully in half. She placed one half in his lap. "You probably can't eat it yet," she said, matter-of-factly. "But I want you to know it's there." And then she talked, not to fill silence, not nervously. She talked the way people talk when they've spent too long with no one listening, with a kind of restrained hunger, measured and deliberate, like she was rationing words she'd been saving up for exactly this kind of moment. She told him about the group home on West 48th, about the administrator, a narrow-faced woman named Sister Delphine, who collected donations every Sunday and distributed them in ways that never quite reached the children. She told him about the other kids, 12 of them, ranging from 4 to 15, and how she, Nala, had developed a system for knowing when something bad was about to happen. She watched shoes, she said. People always gave themselves away in their feet before their face caught up. "The men who came tonight," she said, very quietly, "were wearing shoes with no snow on them, which means they didn't walk, which means they came in a car, which means they planned to come." Park processed this. The lantern pulsed between them, gold and warm, casting shadows that moved like breath against the snow. It was a beautiful object, too beautiful, too specific, too precisely crafted to be a child's toy. The rhythmic pulse it emitted wasn't light fluctuation, it was a frequency, a signal, a beacon carved into the shape of innocence. He couldn't speak, couldn't warn her, couldn't tell her that somewhere above them, in the dark geometry of the city's skyline, A thermal scope was tracking the lantern's glow with surgical patience. And somewhere else, somewhere closer, a black van had just made its third slow pass around the block. The hunters hadn't given up. They were simply waiting to be sure the blizzard had finished what they started. It hadn't, and neither had J.S. Park. 3 hours, 41 minutes. He kept counting. 31 floors up. Cale didn't blink. He hadn't blinked in 11 minutes. The thermal scope of his rifle was pressed to his eye socket with the practiced familiarity of a man who had made distance and darkness his native language for the better part of a decade. Through the scope, the blizzard dissolved into a world of orange and gold heat signatures blooming against the cold blue of the night. 2 signatures, one large, one very small. His jaw tightened. He had been in position since before the storm peaked, having tracked Park's last known coordinates through the encrypted signal in the chairman's cufflink, a tracking chip so small it required a surgical loop to see, sewn into the lining of Park's left cuff by Cale himself 6 months ago, during a period when the internal tensions of the syndicate had begun producing a particular quality of silence that Cale had learned to distrust. He had told no one, not because he was operating outside protocol, but because Cale understood, at the cellular level, that the most dangerous leaks inside an organization never came from the bottom. They came from beside the throne. He had been right. He watched through the scope as Park's men stripped him on the street below, methodical, unhurried, rehearsed, and felt something move through his chest that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite grief. It was the specific pain of a man who had seen something inevitable arrive exactly on schedule. Then the child appeared. Cale had expected her to run. Every civilian calculation said she should run, frightened by the cold, by the stillness of the man in the chair, by the wrongness of the scene. But she didn't. She planted herself beside J.S. Park with the absolute territorial confidence of someone who had decided, in the space of a single breath, that this was her responsibility now. He watched her tuck her coat around the chairman's arm. Something in his throat moved. He reset his focus, locked the crosshairs on the black van idling half a block north. He counted 3 heat signatures inside. Professionals, their discipline was visible even through thermal imaging. The contained, patient stillness of men paid to wait. His finger rested against the trigger guard. Not on the trigger. Against it, because the wind speed at his current elevation was rendering precision impossible. An 80-mile-per-hour crosswind at 31 floors didn't just affect trajectory, it punished arrogance. One miscalculation and the shot would miss by 6 feet. 6 feet in that street meant the child. He could not fire. He pulled out his encrypted cell phone and typed one message to the only number that mattered in this moment, a scrambled line that would bounce through 4 relay points before it reached its destination. Chairman alive. Child present. Van north of position. 3 inside. Wind negative. Cannot engage. Awaiting. He hit send. Then he went back to the scope. Below, the girl had pulled the lantern closer to Park's chest, angling it with careful precision, as though positioning a heater. The amber glow washed over both their faces, Park's stone-still features and the girl's animated, quietly fierce expression as she spoke words Cale couldn't hear through the glass. He watched her mouth move, watched her pull the bread from her bag, watched her place half of it in Park's lap with a solemnity that looked almost ceremonial. Cale had served J.S. Park for 9 years. He had watched men offer the chairman $1 million contracts, rare bottles of aged spirits, deeds to buildings, controlling interests in legitimate enterprises, all to earn a nod, a half smile, a fractional softening in those cold, evaluating eyes. Not one of them had offered bread. The phone vibrated. One word back from the relay chain. Understood. Which meant Park was conscious, which meant the dental click code was still operational, which meant inside that unmoving body, the most dangerous strategist in the New York underworld was already working. The van moved. It rolled slowly, deliberately, toward the corner where Park and the girl sat. Cale tracked it. His scope moved to the windshield, and through the thermal blur he caught it. The faint, distinctive shape of a weapon being checked in the passenger seat. They weren't waiting anymore. His phone vibrated again. 3 words this time. Protect the child. Not protect me. Not extract me. Not neutralize the threat. Protect the child. Cale stared at the words for 1 second. Then he put the phone down, pressed his eye back to the scope, and began calculating. If he couldn't fire a clean shot at the van, he had to think laterally. Across the street from Park's position, a water main ran along the curb line, Striking it with controlled impact would produce a pressurized geyser directly in the van's path, not lethal, but disorienting, loud enough to buy time. He adjusted elevation, wind compensation, held his breath. And then, from below, something changed in the scene that stopped him completely. The lantern had begun to beep, not loudly, but rhythmically, a pulse inside a pulse. And the moment it started, the van braked hard, stopped. The heat signatures inside it became suddenly agitated movement, repositioning, the thermal signature of men reaching for phones. Kyle understood immediately. The lantern wasn't just a lantern. Whatever that child was carrying, it was broadcasting. And it wasn't broadcasting only to the van. Because 3 seconds after the lantern pulsed, a second vehicle appeared from the east, dark, unmarked, government issue by the antenna configuration, and began moving toward the same corner. 2 factions, both converging. 1 child, 1 paralyzed man, 1 lantern, and whatever secret it held sitting between them. Cale's finger finally moved from the guard to the trigger. He had no shot, but he held it anyway. Because sometimes the only thing standing between a target and a bullet was the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was watching. Nala had a system for keeping people alive. She had developed it over 7 years, refined it in group home dormitories, in social worker waiting rooms. In the backseats of cars she'd been transferred through with nothing but a garbage bag of belongings and the quiet, dangerous knowledge that no one in the room was more invested in her survival than she was. The system was simple. Keep them talking. Or if they couldn't talk to them. Because silence, Nala had learned, was where people gave up. And this man, this frozen, motionless, terrifyingly still man in the high-tech wheelchair had not given up. She could see it in his eyes. That was the thing nobody else had looked close enough to notice. His eyes were alive. Not drifting, not glazed. Completely, intensely, furiously alive, tracking her every movement with an awareness so precise and so controlled, it made something in her chest feel tight in a way she couldn't name. Like standing too close to a fire that hadn't been given permission to burn. "My daddy used to do that," she said, settling deeper against the base of his wheelchair, pulling her knees to her chest inside the tent of her oversized coat. Not talk, but listen in a way that felt like talking. She paused, looked at the lantern. He had a mark on his wrist, like a wave, but sharp at the top. He said it meant something in Korean. He said his friend gave it to him. She traced the shape in the snow with 1 finger, a cresting wave, angular, specific. Inside the prison of his body, J.S. Park felt something detonate quietly behind his sternum. The mark she drew was not a wave. It was the sigil of the Chongpa line, the original bloodline marker of the founding family of his syndicate. It was not a tattoo given to friends. It was not decorative. It was a mark burned into the wrist of every man who swore direct loyalty to the Park throne, and removed, surgically, from the wrists of every man who broke that oath. The only way her father had that mark was if he had once stood inside the syndicate's innermost circle. "He disappeared when I was 3, Nala continued. Her voice stayed even. She had told this story before to counselors, to caseworkers, to the ceiling of various dormitory rooms, and the evenness wasn't numbness. It was the particular steadiness of a child who had decided long ago that grief was not a reason to stop functioning. They told me he just left, but I knew he didn't, because he left the lantern." She held it up between them. The amber glow pulsed. "He built it. It has his fingerprints inside the glass. I checked." Park's mind was running at a velocity completely disproportionate to his motionless body. He was cross-referencing, cataloging. A man with the Chongpa mark disappeared approximately 4 years ago, connected somehow to this child, to this group home on West 48th. 4 years ago, Park had ordered exactly 3 internal executions, all 3 for confirmed betrayal, all 3 carried out by his brother. "Do you have a picture?" Nala asked no one in particular, then caught herself and looked at him with a small, complicated expression. "Sorry, I know you can't answer." She reached into her canvas bag and produced a folded photograph. It was worn soft at the creases, the kind of worn that happens not from carelessness but from too much handling, from being taken out and looked at and put back too many times. She held it at an angle that let the lantern's light fall across it. Park couldn't move his head, but his eyes tracked down. The man in the photograph was laughing. Caught mid-motion, 1 hand raised, the angle of his jaw carrying something unmistakably familiar in its architecture, a particular bone structure that Park had seen reflected in training rooms, in safe houses, across the kind of table where irreversible decisions get made quietly, and on the man's left wrist, visible at the edge of his rolled sleeve, the wave-shaped sigil. Park knew him. He had known him for 11 years before the order came down, had trusted him with route logistics, with safe house coordinates, with the particular silence required to move money through legitimate channels without leaving fingerprints. He had been precise, loyal, devastatingly competent, and then, 4 years ago, he had made a single catastrophic error of judgment that had exposed 2 undercover operations. Park hadn't ordered his death. His brother had, without authorization, without tribunal, without the 7-day review period that the syndicate's own internal code demanded before any execution of a ranked member. His brother had moved unilaterally, impulsively, and then buried the paperwork so efficiently that by the time Park discovered what had happened, the man was already gone, and the girl, his daughter, had already been absorbed into the city's foster system, invisible and unreachable. Park had looked for her. For 8 months, quietly, through back channels. He had found nothing, because his brother had erased the trail. And now she was here, in front of him, feeding him bread, keeping him alive. The lantern pulsed again, 3 short beats, too long, and Nala looked at it with a small frown. "It's been doing that since the men in the van started circling," she said, very calmly. "I think it's counting them." She tucked the photograph back into her bag, stood up, and looked north up the street with an expression that no 7-year-old should have been able to produce: flat, calculating, patient. Then she turned back to Park and crouched to eye level with him, her dark eyes meeting his with an alignment so direct it felt like a conversation. "There are 4 of them now," she said. "I can tell because there are 4 shadows under the streetlight and only 1 car, which means 3 got out." She reached down and locked both wheels of his chair with a precise, practiced motion. "Don't go anywhere," she whispered. And then she did something so breathtakingly unexpected that even the man watching through a thermal scope 31 floors above them stopped breathing for a full 3 seconds. Nala walked toward the van. She didn't run. That was the thing that would haunt every man who witnessed it afterward in debriefs, in whispered conversations, in the strange, vulnerable hours of early morning when professionals who had seen everything found themselves replaying the moments that had broken their understanding of how human beings were supposed to behave. She didn't run toward the van. She walked, small, deliberate, her red coat dragging through the slush, the lantern held out in front of her like she was leading a procession through a cathedral. The men from the van saw her coming and did not know what to do with that. There were 3 of them on the street, the 4th remained behind the wheel, engine idling. They were dressed in paramedic uniforms, white and high-visibility orange, stethoscopes, equipment bags, the entire visual grammar of emergency response. But Nala had already noticed the shoes. Paramedics wore rubber-soled work boots, salt-stained, worn at the heel from long shifts on hard floors. These men wore clean leather, thin-soled, the kind that required polish, the kind worn by men who spent their days in rooms, not corridors, and beneath the left cuff of the nearest man's uniform visible for just 1 second as he raised his arm to signal the others a tattoo. Black ink, a dragon coiling from wrist to elbow, its detail too fine, too deliberate, too expensive to belong to anyone who had chosen this uniform legitimately. Nala catalogued all of this in the time it took her to cross the street. "Are you here for the man in the chair?" she asked. The nearest man crouched down to her level. He had a practiced face, warm, concerned, the expression of someone trained to produce calm in frightened people. His eyes, however, were running a rapid, professional assessment of the scene behind her. "Yes, sweetheart. We got a call. We're here to help him." "What's his name?" Nala asked. A beat, almost imperceptible. But Nala had spent 7 years reading the pauses between words in people who were deciding how much truth to allocate. "We don't always get names with a call, honey. That's why we came to check." "He told me his name," she said. Another pause, longer. "Did he?" He whispered it. Before he went quiet, she tilted her head. "He said if anyone comes without saying it back to me, I shouldn't let them near him." The man's practiced warmth stayed in place, but something behind it rearranged. He glanced over her head at his colleagues, a microcommunication, quick and coded, and then looked back at her with a smile that had been recalibrated for patience. Sweetheart, he's very sick. We need to move him before. What hospital? Nala asked. Excuse me? Which hospital are you taking him to? Because the closest trauma center with a neurology unit is Mount Sinai on 5th, and your ambulance is pointed south. Complete silence. The wind howled between them, lifting the hem of her red coat, scattering snow across the slush-darkened street. The lantern pulsed. Nala held it steady. Her expression hadn't changed, that same flat, patient, reading the room look that she had walked over here wearing. The man stood up. He was no longer crouching to her level. He was standing at his full height, and the practiced warmth had left his face entirely, replaced by something that was not quite irritation and not quite admiration, but existed in the uncomfortable territory between them. Move out of the way, he said, quietly. That particular quiet that isn't calm but is instead the pressurized stillness before something breaks. No, said Nala. She reached into the pocket of her red coat and produced a short piece of rebar no longer than her forearm, the kind that fell from construction sites and accumulated in gutters and empty lots where children played. She had picked it up 2 blocks north of the group home, because Nala had learned that the city left useful things lying around for people who paid attention. She jammed it through both spokes of Park's wheelchair simultaneously, locking the wheels with an audible metallic clang that rang out sharp and clear through the blizzard. Then she reached down into the slush beside the chair and, with one quick motion, pulled the release key from the wheelchair's manual override slot and pressed it deep into the snow beside the curb, marking the spot only in her memory. You can't move him, she said. And you can't move me. And if you try... The man raised his hand. Not slowly, not with hesitation. He raised it with the swift, reflexive authority of someone who had never been seriously questioned by anyone small, and the motion was meant to end the conversation in a single, decisive way. What stopped him wasn't fear. It was a sound. From the wheelchair behind Nala, from the body that had been silent and motionless for the better part of 3 hours, came a sound so low and so specific that it seemed to come from somewhere beneath the blizzards. Register entirely. Not a groan, not a word, something more fundamental than either. A vibration from deep inside a chest that had been holding itself very, very still, and had decided that the sight of a raised hand above a child's face was the precise circumstance under which stillness became unacceptable. The man froze. He looked at the wheelchair, at the motionless body inside it, at the eyes, those devastatingly alert, furiously alive eyes that were looking back at him, with an expression that required no translation in any language on earth. Touch her, came the voice from the chair, barely audible, barely human in its register, ground down to its lowest, most essential frequency, by 3 hours of enforced silence, and the kind of rage that doesn't perform itself but simply exists, absolute and total, like bedrock under ice. And I will take apart every single thing you love. The man took 1 step back, then another. The lantern pulsed 4 rapid beats now, urgent, almost frantic, and from somewhere to the east, through the wall of white, came the sound of a second engine, then a third. The unmarked government vehicle that Kale had spotted through his thermal scope slid to a stop at the far end of the block. 3 men in dark coats stepped out, not rushing, not drawing weapons, simply placing themselves with the quiet authority of people who represented something considerably larger than themselves. The van's driver leaned on the horn once, short, sharp, a recall signal. The men on the street looked at each other, looked at the girl, looked at the chair, made the only calculation available to them in that particular configuration of variables, and moved back to the van with the controlled, unhurried pace of men who needed to look like this had been their plan all along. The van pulled away, no plates visible through the snow. Nala watched it go. Then she turned back to J.S. Park, walked to his chair, and crouched in front of him eye level, unafraid, her braids dusted white, her dark eyes running a quiet inventory of his face with that same searching, honest attention she had given him from the very beginning. You talked, she said. Something moved across Park's face, barely perceptible, but it was there. They won't come back the same way, she said, but they'll come back. She retrieved the lantern from where she'd set it against the wheel, looked at its pulsing light for a long moment, and then looked up not at Park, but past him, into the dark geometry of the skyline above them, as though she could feel the weight of a scope 31 floors up. We're not alone, she said quietly. Are we? It wasn't a question. and somewhere in the marrow of his returning body in the first faint, electric suggestion of sensation, beginning to move back through his fingers like dawn breaking across a frozen shore. J.S. Park felt something shift that had nothing to do with the toxin. 2 hours, 53 minutes remaining. He had never needed them more. The cold had a second sound, one he hadn't registered before, beneath the wind, beneath the snow. It was the sound of a man beginning, against every calculation he had ever made about himself, to feel something he had no tactical category for. He tried to file it, tried to label it and contain it in the part of his mind reserved for variables that required monitoring but not response. It wouldn't stay there. It kept moving warm, persistent, irrational like the residual heat from a child's coat pressed against his arm. He needed to think about the lantern. He needed to think about its architect, about who had built a device that sophisticated and placed it in the hands of a 7-year-old girl in a group home on West 48th. That chain of custody had a logic. It had an intention, and intentions of that particular complexity did not emerge from small interests or short timelines. Someone had been playing a very long game. The question, the one that pressed against the inside of his paralyzed chest with more urgency than the cold, was whether that game had been designed to save him or to use him. "You keep looking at it," Nala said. She was watching him with that focused, assessing attention that he was beginning to understand was simply how she moved through the world. Not suspicious, not fearful. Just permanently, quietly alert the way a person becomes when they have learned early that their safety depends entirely on their own perception. "My daddy built it so I could always find him," she said. "Or so he could find me." She paused. "I think maybe it does both." The snow was falling differently now, not the chaotic lateral assault of the blizzard's peak, but something heavier, more vertical, the kind of snowfall that preceded a temporary lull. Park tracked this automatically, the meteorological calculation running beneath every other process in his mind. A lull meant visibility. Visibility meant Kale might get his window. It also meant the men in the van would reposition with confidence they currently lacked. The timing was going to be very close. Then he felt it. It started in his right index finger, not movement, not yet, but the memory of movement. A faint, electrical suggestion, like a signal struggling through static. The toxin's hold was beginning to fracture at the extremities first, exactly as the pharmacology predicted. He focused everything he had on that finger. Every ounce of concentration compressed into the single, absolute task of bending it. It moved. Not dramatically, not visibly through the coat. A millimeter, maybe 2. But it moved, and the sensation that accompanied it was extraordinary, not relief, not triumph, but a cold, clarifying fury that flooded through him like current through wire. The ghost of New York did not process his returning body as a gift. He processed it as a weapon coming back online, one function at a time. "Something's different," Nala said. She was looking at his hand beneath the coat, at the barely perceptible shift in the fabric's surface. Her eyes came up to his with that directness, that complete, uncalculated directness that cut through every defense he had ever constructed around himself and made contact with something underneath that he hadn't verified was still there. "You moved. You moved." He held her gaze. "Okay," she said simply, as though this changed the tactical picture in ways she was already calculating. She stood, smoothed her thermal layer, and looked north, then east, then at the dark shape of the government vehicle still idling at the end of the block. Her chin lifted slightly, a gesture so similar to something he did himself when assessing a room that it stopped him completely. Then she walked to the government vehicle, knocked on the passenger window, and waited. The window came down 2 inches. "I know what's in the lantern," she said to whoever sat behind the glass. "And I know who sent it, and if you want to know too, you'll stay exactly where you are and you won't let anyone through until he tells you himself." A long silence from inside the vehicle. "How will we know when that is?" "Because he'll stand up," Nala said. She turned and walked back to the wheelchair, sat back beside him, pulled her knees to her chest and looked at the lantern with an expression that held something she hadn't shown yet, not fear exactly, but the quiet, a weighty awareness of someone who understood that the next hour was going to ask things of her that 7 years of living had only partially prepared her for. Park's second finger moved, then his third. 51 minutes later, 42 minutes ahead of the toxin's predicted schedule, driven by something that no pharmacology textbook had adequately quantified. J.S. Park placed both hands on the arms of his wheelchair. and pushed himself to his feet. The blizzard screamed around him. His legs shook, his vision fractured at the edges. Every nerve in his body was firing simultaneously, a full system reboot happening in real time, painful and electric and absolute. He stood. Nala looked up at him. Snow dusted across her puff braids, her dark eyes wide and bright and completely unsurprised, like she had been waiting for exactly this. Like she had known, from the moment she sat beside him on the frozen ground, that this was always where they were going to end up. He reached down, lifted her from the ground gently, despite the shaking in his arms, with the particular care of a man handling something irreplaceable, and settled her into the wheelchair that had been his prison for 3 hours. Then he wrapped his body around hers, and the first bullet hit the chair's frame like a thunderclap. He didn't flinch. He was the wall now, and walls don't flinch. The Manhattan Bridge in a blizzard was not a place, it was a condition. Wind at elevation was a different animal entirely from wind at street level, not gusty, not variable, but a single sustained force with the consistency and indifference of something geological. It pressed against a person's chest like a hand, like an intention, like the physical expression of a city trying to push you off its edge. Snow moved horizontally across the bridge's span, reducing visibility to roughly 8 feet in any direction. The steel cables sang a note that lived in the body rather than the ear, low, continuous, vibrating through the soles of boots and up through the skeleton like a frequency meant for other species. J.S. Park walked across it like he owned it. He didn't walk steadily. His gait was still compromised, the toxin's exit was not clean but ragged, retreating from his nervous system in waves, leaving behind pockets of numbness that made his left knee unreliable and his right shoulder slow. He walked anyway. Nala rode in the wheelchair he pushed, wrapped in his coat, now the heavy charcoal wool that carried sandalwood and cold air, and something else beneath both that she had pressed her face briefly into when he draped it around her, the way children take inventory of safety through scent before they take it through reason. Her small hands gripped the armrests. Her eyes moved in constant arcs across the bridge's white-blinded span. She had not asked where they were going. She trusted his direction the way she trusted the lantern, not blindly, but based on evidence she had compiled herself and found sufficient. That trust was the most dangerous thing anyone had handed him in 19 years. He was aware of it the way a man becomes aware of a wound, not in the moment it happens, but in the stillness afterward, when the adrenaline drops and the body begins its honest accounting. 3 entry points, she said quietly, without prompting. Behind us, the South Tower. Ahead, the North Anchorage. And there's a service ladder on the east side, below the pedestrian rail. He looked down at her. I read the maintenance signs when we came on, she said simply. He filed this, kept moving. They came out of the white wall at the bridge's midspan and found them waiting. 3 tactical teams, 12 men total, positioned in a deliberate geometry across the width of the bridge that left no angle uncovered. They were not his brother's street soldiers. These were professionals, equipped with suppressed weapons and thermal optics that cut through the blizzard with surgical efficiency. They had been placed here not to create an ambush but to create a demonstration, a show of overwhelming force designed to communicate that the outcome of this encounter had already been decided. His brother stood in the center. He was not wearing a coat. This was deliberate, a performance of invulnerability so characteristic of him that Park felt something almost like nostalgia, alongside the cold, absolute clarity of what needed to happen next. His brother was 41 years old, 3 years Park's junior, with the same angular jaw and black hair. But everything that Park carried inward, his brother had always worn externally: the ambition, the resentment, the need to be seen as the more capable, the more worthy, the rightful one. You're walking, his brother said. Across 12 feet of howling wind, his voice carried with the particular resonance of a man who had rehearsed this moment. Disappointed? Park asked. Impressed. Briefly. His brother's gaze dropped to the wheelchair. To Nala. Something moved across his face, not regret, but a kind of irritated recalculation. The child complicates things. She does, Park agreed. Send her to the rail. She doesn't need to see this. No, said Nala. Both men looked at her. She was sitting very straight in the wheelchair, the lantern in her lap, her dark eyes moving between them with an assessment that was making at least 3 of the tactical team visibly uncomfortable. She had that quality, the quality of someone who sees more than they are supposed to, and who has no social incentive to pretend otherwise. He's going to tell you about the group home, she said, looking at Park. He's been holding it since before we got here. He has a detonator. She paused, his left hand. He keeps touching his left coat pocket. Park's brother went very still. Smart child, he said, quietly, a different kind of quiet from before. Her father was smarter, Park said. The word landed between them like something dropped from a great height. Park watched his brother's face process it, the micro-expressions moving beneath the controlled surface, like weather beneath ice. Recognition, calculation, the rapid, involuntary assessment of what Park, knowing that, at this moment, on this bridge, meant for every plan his brother had constructed over the past 4 years. You knew, his brother said. I know everything, Park said, eventually. Then you know the detonator is real. I know the children in that building are already gone, Park said. I moved them 2 hours ago, while you were watching me sit in the snow. For the first time in Park's memory, his brother had nothing to say. The silence stretched across the bridge span, filled only by the wind's enormous, indifferent voice. Then the sky changed. It started as sound, a deep, rhythmic percussion that cut through the blizzard's register from above, multiplied, layered, growing until it became something that could be felt in the chest cavity before it could be seen. Then the searchlights came through, the white 6 of them, from 6 directions simultaneously, converging on the bridge's midspan with the kind of choreographed precision that required months of planning and total loyalty from every person involved. The helicopters descended, and from the bridge's surface, from the service ladders, from the maintenance walkways beneath, men appeared, not rushing, not tactical. They moved with the calm, deliberate pace of people who had arrived at a conclusion rather than a conflict. Hundreds of them, materializing from the blizzard's white interior like the storm had been hiding them all along. They knelt. In the snow, on the frozen steel, without being instructed, without hesitation, every one of them, facing Park, and the girl in the wheelchair beside him. Park's brother looked around at what he had tried to take at the empire he had tried to steal, kneeling now in the snow before the man he had left to freeze, and for the first time in his life, he looked small. Nala reached up and took Park's hand. Her small fingers wrapped around 3 of his, and she held on with a grip that was warm and steady and completely certain. Now, she said softly, looking up at him. What do we do? The gun was cold. Everything was cold, the bridge, the air, the steel cables singing overhead, but the gun in Park's hand carried a specific coldness, the kind that lived in metal kept close to a body for years, warmed repeatedly, and then allowed to cool, until the temperature it held became something intermediate, not human warmth, not ambient cold. Something in between, a tool that existed at the border between intention and consequence. He held it on his brother. 12 feet of frozen air between them. The helicopters held their altitude, their searchlights turning the blizzard into a theater of white light and moving shadow. The men in the snow stayed kneeling perfectly, absolutely still, and the silence they created was more commanding than anything Park could have ordered, because it had not been ordered. It had simply arrived, the way certain truths arrive, without announcement, without drama, carrying only their own weight. His brother stood without flinching. This was the thing about him, had always been the thing that Park had simultaneously respected and found deeply, specifically dangerous. He did not flinch. Not from consequences, not from pain, not from the acknowledgement that he had miscalculated catastrophically. He absorbed the reality of his position with the same flat, controlled composure he brought to everything, and he waited, because waiting was the only move left to him. Say it, his brother said. Whatever you've been building to. I knew about the poison 6 weeks ago, Park said. A chemist in Busan. You used the same contact 3 years ago for a different problem. He has a long memory and a short loyalty. His brother's jaw shifted, fractionally. I knew about the bridge, Park continued. I knew about the tactical teams. I knew about the group home, which is why the children were moved at 9 p.m., before the storm peaked. He paused. What I didn't know was why. Power, his brother said, simply, without shame. The same reason you know, the same reason our father knew, the same reason every man in this family has ever done anything. No, Park said. I built this to protect something. You tried to take it to fill something. Those are different architectures. His brother looked at him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, not performance, not strategy, just the involuntary expression of a man who had reached the bottom of something, he laughed. Short. Exhausted. You always had the words, he said. I had her father's words, Park said. He told me, the last time I spoke to him before you killed him without authorization, that power without restraint was just damage looking for a target. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Heavier, more specific. Nala had not moved from beside the wheelchair. She stood in the snow, the lantern in her left hand, her right hand at her side. Her dark eyes moving between the two men with an expression that was not a child's expression. It was the face of someone doing complex, real-time moral accounting, adding and subtracting variables that most adults would struggle to hold simultaneously. Then she stepped forward, not toward his brother, toward Park. She placed her small hand on the barrel of the gun, not grabbing it, not deflecting it, simply resting her palm against the cold metal with a weight and a presence that communicated something language would have made smaller. If you kill him, she said, and her voice was very quiet, very steady, the voice of someone who had thought about this already, had perhaps been thinking about it since the bridge, then the thing that was worth saving tonight isn't worth saving anymore. Park looked down at her hand on the gun. At her face, the snowflakes caught in her puff braids, the amber light of the lantern washing her brown skin in gold, the particular expression in her eyes that he had no adequate word for because the language he had built his life in did not include a category for this specific variety of being seen. He lowered the gun. Not slowly, not with performance. He lowered it the way a man puts down something he has been holding for too long completely, finally, with the physical relief of a decision that has already been processed somewhere deeper than conscious thought. His brother exhaled. Exile, Park said. Every account frozen, every property transferred, every contact severed. You leave this city tonight, and every city I operate in. You build something new with your own name, your own hands, and if I ever see your face again in anything that touches mine, the mercy that happened here will not happen again. His brother looked at him, at Nala, at the kneeling men in the snow. Then he did something Park had not anticipated. He reached into his left coat pocket and placed the detonator on the bridge's railing. Set it down gently, deliberately, the gesture of a man surrendering not just a device but an argument. Understood, he said. And then he walked, past the tactical teams, past the helicopter's beams, into the white, into the blizzard's interior, diminishing with each step until the snow took him entirely and left nothing behind except the wind and the sound of the city breathing underneath all of it. But Park watched the direction he disappeared into for 3 seconds longer than was necessary, because a man who plans a 4-year betrayal with jellyfish toxin and tactical teams does not accept exile as a final answer. He accepts it as a reposition. Somewhere in the white, his brother was already calculating the next move. Park filed this, said nothing, kept it close. Nala watched him disappear. Then she looked up at Park and said, with the absolute simplicity of a child stating arithmetic, "You chose right." Something moved through J.S. Park's chest that he had not felt since he was 8 years old. It moved through him like the first warmth after very long, cold, slow, almost painful, and completely irreversible. He crouched down to her level, snow on his shoulders, ice in his hair, his body still trembling faintly with the residue of the toxin and the cold and the particular exhaustion of a man who has been through something that has changed the shape of him. He looked at her for a long time. "What is your full name?" he asked. "Nala," she said, then quietly, "I don't have the other part yet." He held her gaze. "You will," he said. 1 week. 7 days was not enough time to rebuild an empire, but it was enough time to reclaim one. The syndicate had reorganized with the efficiency of a body healing itself, old loyalties re-establishing, compromised channels being cauterized and rerouted. The particular ecosystem of power that J.S. Park had spent 19 years cultivating, returning to its operational state with an organic speed that confirmed what Kale had always believed that the organization's stability had. Never truly rested in its structures. It rested in the specific gravity of the man at its center. Park moved differently now. It was subtle, the kind of change that required knowing someone across a long baseline to detect. Kale noticed it. The syndicate's senior members noticed it. In the particular way people notice a shift in weather before they can name what changed. Park had always been precise, controlled, formidably self-contained. He still was. But something in the containment had altered its nature. It was no longer the containment of a man holding himself away from the world. It was the containment of a man holding something inside himself worth protecting. The penthouse was warm. 43rd floor, facing south. The city sprawled beneath its floor-to-ceiling windows in its usual magnificent, indifferent configuration. 10,000 lights across a January night. The blizzard's aftermath leaving the streets below still dusted white. The Hudson, a dark ribbon pressed against the grid's western edge. The furniture was precisely what anyone who knew nothing about Park would have expected. Spare, expensive, Japanese minimalist, designed by an architect who understood that real power didn't need to announce itself through excess. What they would not have expected was the small pair of red boots by the entryway, or the half-finished puzzle on the low table by the window, or the sound, coming from the interior hallway, of someone negotiating loudly with a member of the security detail about whether a second cup of hot chocolate at 9:30 p.m. constituted a reasonable request. The security detail lost. Nala appeared in the doorway of the main room wearing an enormous sleep shirt navy blue, syndicate issued, long enough on her small frame to constitute a dress with her puff braids freshly redone, both of them listing slightly to the left in the way they always did by evening, as though her hair had opinions about symmetry that softened as the day wore on. She carried her hot chocolate in both hands with the focused reverence of someone transporting something precious, and she crossed the room to the low table, stepped over the puzzle without looking down, and settled onto the Persian rug with a competence and ease that suggested she had been doing this for years rather than days. Park watched her from the window. He had been standing there for 11 minutes, which was how long it had taken him to read the final set of legal documents, the ones his attorney had delivered that evening, with the particular careful expression lawyers produce when they are aware they are participating in something that will outlast their understanding of it. The papers were simple, as such things went. Clear language, binding in every jurisdiction that mattered. They required only his signature and her assent, which she had given that afternoon in the attorney's office with a gravity and a certainty that had made the attorney a man who had facilitated the legal architecture of 3 international criminal enterprises without blinking. Visibly emotional. Park crossed the room. He sat on the floor beside her, not in a chair, not at a remove, but on the Persian rug at her level, and set the documents on the table between them. She looked at them, at his face, back at the documents. She picked up her hot chocolate and drank from it with both hands, thinking, and he waited with the particular patience he had discovered, in the past 7 days, that she required when she was processing something important. "Does it mean you're my dad?" she asked. "Legally," he said, "and in every other way I know how to be." She considered this. "I've never had one of those before. Not a whole one." "I know," he said. "I haven't been one before. We'll figure it out." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and put her hand on his, that same gesture from the bridge, that small, warm, certain hand resting on top of his larger one, and this time there was no gun between them. Just her fingers and his. Just the warmth of the room and the city lights and the sound of the security detail pretending not to be emotionally affected in the hallway. "Okay," she said. He reached beneath the table and produced the box. She opened it with the unself-conscious directness she brought to everything. Inside, folded in black tissue paper, was a coat red, the same shade as the one she'd draped across his frozen shoulders in the blizzard, but this one had been rebuilt, every seam reinforced. The lining she ran her fingers along it and looked up at him with narrowed eyes. "Is this bulletproof?" "Kevlar woven silk," he said. "Custom." And there. She found it before he could direct her. Along the inner collar, in thread the color of old gold, 2 words embroidered in characters so fine they required the light at a particular angle to read. "Park Nala." She stared at it for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, not overflowing, not performing, just carrying the specific brightness of someone who has received something they stopped believing was possible a long time ago, and has not yet found the language for what that feels like. "Put it on," he said quietly. She did. It was still large on her, she would grow into it, and she sat in it on the Persian rug with the lantern she'd insisted on bringing from the street, still glowing amber beside the puzzle pieces, and she looked at him with an expression that held everything the past week had been, and everything the future was going to require. "Teach me something," she said. "What do you want to know?" She thought about it. Outside, the city hummed its enormous, ceaseless hum, 10 million lives running simultaneously, none of them aware that in a penthouse on the 43rd floor, the ghost of New York was sitting cross-legged on a rug, learning for the first time in his life that the most dangerous thing a person can become is someone worth protecting. "Everything," she said. "Start with something easy." He reached out and picked up a puzzle piece. She picked up one too. And the most feared man in New York and the little girl who had refused to leave him in the blizzard sat together in the warm gold light of the lantern her father had built, in a city that would never be quite the same as it was before the storm, and they began. And that right there is where J.S. Park's story was supposed to end. But here's the thing about children who have spent their whole lives invisible. They see things. They remember things. They carry things that adults, in their certainty and their power and their careful management of what they allow themselves to feel, walk right past. Nala had been studying the lantern every night since they left the bridge. The frequency, the pattern, the specific intervals between pulses that she had been recording with the quiet, methodical diligence of a child who understood, on some cellular level, that the answer to the most important question of her life was buried somewhere inside that amber glow. And 3 days after the adoption papers were signed, she told Park what she'd found. He went very still, because the signal inside the lantern, the one her father had built, the one that had drawn every faction in the city to that corner in the blizzard, was not broadcasting to the FBI. It was not broadcasting to a government frequency or a syndicate relay, or any of the dozen institutional architectures Park had already investigated and eliminated. It was broadcasting to a person, a specific, singular person identified in the signal's encoding by a Chongpa designation so senior it existed above every rank Park had ever assigned. A person who, according to every record Park had ever accessed, every death certificate, every confirmed elimination report bearing his brother's authorization seal, was dead. Park stood at the penthouse window for a long time after Nala fell asleep, the lantern pulsing its quiet amber rhythm on the table behind him, the city spread below in all its unknowing brightness. His brother had exiled into the white. The lantern was calling to a ghost. And somewhere between those two facts was a geometry that Park had not yet mapped, an architecture built in the dark over years, patient and precise, and aimed at something he could not yet name. He pressed one hand flat against the cold glass. The city looked back at him, indifferent and enormous, full of its 10 million secrets. He had survived the blizzard. He had reclaimed his throne. He had found the girl and brought her home. But the game, the real game, the one that had started long before the poison and the snow and the bridge had not ended, it had simply moved into the next room. And J.S. Park, the ghost of New York, had never been afraid of the dark. He turned from the window, looked at the lantern, watched it pulse steady, patient, waiting. He picked up his phone. This story is not over. If Nala's courage moved something in you tonight, if that moment on the bridge hit somewhere deep, do me one small favor before you go. Hit that subscribe button, because part 2 is coming, and what they find inside that signal will change everything you thought you understood about this story. Drop your city in the comments right now. Where are you watching from? And tell me, were you Team Nala from the moment she walked toward that van, or did she earn you on the bridge? Because that answer says everything. I read every single one. Part 2 drops soon. Don't miss it.